welcome back everyone. Today we're going to continue on with period 4, and in today's talk we're going to be talking about slavery, we're going to talk about reforms, and a little bit about technology during this time period. I know you may have noticed that I haven't exactly been going by the chapters in the book, but that's because I was trying to make a choice between whether it was going to be better to follow the note outline that I had posted for you on Blackboard or to go strictly by the chapters. And I'm not one that usually goes by the book strictly, so I thought it was going to be best just to go by, the note outline, and it would be easier for you to follow along in your notes that way and add to them. So today we're going to start with the planter aristocracy of the antebellum South. Antebellum just means before an event, so antebellum South is before the Civil War. And at this time in the South, they were kind of ruled by a planter aristocracy. The 250 some odd very large plantations across the South pretty much had control over everything else. And so that's why they call it the planter aristocracy. Out of all of the whites in the South, less than 20% had any slaves whatsoever. And out of that 20%, less than 5% had more than 20 slaves. So the vast majority of whites didn't own any slaves at all. And then out of the ones that did, it was like 1 or 2 slaves, 3 or 4. They might have a couple to help out in the fields and a couple to help in the house. Sometimes it was just one of each. And so a lot of the whites in the South that did not have any slaves, they were considered white trash and hillbillies. You weren't good enough. Now, that wasn't always the case. A lot of your larger farms were self-sufficient. They had large enough families to be able to work the land within their family. I don't know if you've ever heard of the movie Shenandoah that's got Jimmy Stewart in it, but it is about a family like this who had several children. They lived up in the Shenandoah Valley area of Virginia, and they tried really hard to stay out of the war because they didn't own slaves, they didn't need slaves, and they didn't feel like that was a war that they needed to be in. Of course, they finally get dragged into it as that story goes on. But there's going to be a lot of larger farms across the South that don't have the need for slaves because they're self-sufficient. There is a book out there called by Hinton Helper called The Impending Crisis of the South. And this is one that is going to promote the idea that the people that suffered the most from slavery were the poor whites because they could not compete with the free labor market that slavery provided in the South. And so they found it very difficult to find wage labor type jobs in the South, and it kept them in the status of being poor. Now, not all of the blacks in the United States were slaves. There's going to be a fairly large slave population. I mean, black population that's free. They come over free. They intermarry and have children, so that's that natural reproduction. As we get closer and closer to 1860, a lot of your northern states are going to pass laws that grant either gradual emancipation for slavery or just outright abolish it because they didn't need that form of labor up in the north. And so it became very easy for them to abolish it. But if escaped slaves, say, escaped to Massachusetts where they had abolished slavery, they had to stay in the state. If they got out into another area that hadn't done so, bounty hunters were always looking for escaped slaves so they could return them to their masters and give them money off of returning them back. You also have got blacks that are going to gain their freedom through various means, one of which is fighting for in one of the wars. So like in the French and Indian War or in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, a lot of slaves will gain their freedom from fighting in the war. And then others will gain their freedom just in the wills of their master. Thomas Jefferson is going to free his slaves in his will. George Washington's wife, Martha Washington, is going to free his slaves after he dies. And so this type of freedom is called manumission. And so it's important to know that what that term means. Now, some of the interesting things about free blacks, they did not get to enjoy the same level of freedom that whites did, even though they were free. The racial democracy, by the time we get to 1860, there is only 5 New England states that are going to allow blacks to vote. Blacks could not testify in court against a white person. They could not own dogs. They couldn't own guns. They couldn't possess liquor. They could not strike a white for any reason whatsoever, even in self-defense. And so they still had lots of restrictions on them. In fact, in a lot of places in the North, race is going to replace class as a boundary between who had political freedom and who did not. There is probably going to be about 500,000 free blacks in the country. Most of them are going to live up in the upper South. We're talking about Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky. That would be considered the upper South. If they live in the deep South, then they congregate in places like New Orleans and Charleston, where in the city they have more safety in numbers and stuff like that. But it was not unheard of for a free black in the North to be scarfed up by a bounty hunter and sold into slavery in the South. If you have seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, that's all about what happens to a free black in the North who gets thrown into slavery for 12 years into the South. Now, planters, let me move my slide to where you need it, in the South are going to be the ones that are going to have the most number of slaves. They're going to have, upwards of 200, 250 slaves on these very large plantations. The slavery was something that was very, very expensive to participate in. And so that's why in plantation slavery, they're going to call their slaves black ivory. Ivory is a very expensive commodity. And so you have to pay a lot of money for it. Well, they had to pay a lot of money for their slaves as well. Think of the largest man think of some of these big old football players, regardless of what race they are, who are big and they're muscular. They can take a lot of stress. They can work really hard. And black men of that size usually would go for upwards of $1,000 a piece, and in that time period, that's like $60,000 to $70,000, and so they were very expensive to buy, and so that's why they were called black ivory. The major concentration of slavery is going to be in the Deep South. I'm going to show you this next map. So you can you have the tobacco fields over here, but your cotton belt goes this way. So the cotton belt was also known as the black belt because that's where so many slaves were. The the number you can see here on this graph, how many slaves and how they had increased between 1790 and 1860. Let me see if I can move this up so you can see the numbers here. And you can see the numbers of slaves owned by, these different groups. So you can see here, up to 4 slaves was the biggest group. So you can see that it wasn't always it wasn't like a widespread. Now that doesn't mean that the poor whites didn't want to, increase their income so they could later have enough money to own slaves for themselves. It was a status symbol to own slaves. There are instances where even slaves gained their freedom and acquired land and had slaves of their own. There's well-documented stuff about Native Americans having slaves. And so it was, back in this time period, a rather accepted practice that if you were wealthy and you had lots of land to work, that you had slaves to help you work it. Here's a map and a graph for you of the free black population by 1860. And you can see most of them are up in the northern part in that direction. Now, by the time we get to the early 1800s, cotton has replaced sugar as the world's major crop. 3/4 of the world's cotton supply is coming out of the South and is going to the New England textile mills and over to Great Britain. So that by 1860, half of our total exports are coming from cotton. Slaves are going to be considered as property. So they have certain rules that are called slave codes that they have to adhere to that will later mimic what become black codes after the Civil War. So they're not allowed to testify against a white. They cannot own guns. They can't be taught to read and write. They could not marry. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't in symbolism. If you've ever been to a African American wedding, sometimes they'll do this traditional thing where they jump the broom. And that was back in slave times how they indicated that they had gotten married. They would jump a broom. They could not gather in groups unless there was a white present, and they couldn't leave the plantation without permission. That's without written permission. If they got caught off their plantation, that was a severe punishment. But they will enjoy a better lifestyle in United States slavery than they will in other places where they've been enslaved. So, like for instance, in Central and South America. So their diets are going to be better. They're going to be less likely to suffer from the deadly diseases. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the plantation owners and the slave masters, although they might be cruel to them if they ran off and whipped them, they're not going to damage them so much that they can't work. It would be like buying a very expensive car and throwing a wrench into the engine. And so they're going to consider the way that having their slaves is good for them. They're taking care of them. If it weren't for us, they would be starving and they would be sick all the time. And so we're doing them a good thing. And that's how they're going to try and justify this awful practice of slavery. The type of labor at this time is mostly going to still be gang labor, although especially in the rice fields, they're still going to adhere to task labor, where they have a certain task they have to get done, and then they can be done with their day. But most of, especially cotton fields, it's going to be a form of gang labor. I want to show you this slide here. This is a cotton field, and if you look at these slaves, see how they're bent over? Picking cotton is a back-breaking work. This would be the overseer here. And you can see it's easier for the children because they're about the same height as the cotton plant. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see cotton on the plant, but it is, the plant itself, when it pops, is very sharp edged. And so if you don't have calloused hands, it would rip your hands. The cotton seeds are real kind of sticky inside of it. My father picked cotton every summer of his life growing up. He was a poor white kid living out in the country area south of Dallas, and he picked cotton and he picked okra, onions. That's what they did in the summertime. And so he would talk about how it would make your hands rough and stuff like that. And so with the life of a slave being what it was, they are going to cling to religion as a hope of moving on from this kind of a life. And so the American Methodist Episcopal Church is going to form, and that's going to be where a lot of slaves are going to get comfort and solace during this time of being imprisoned. Now, that does not mean that there were not slaves that rose up and tried to get away. There's going to be several that are going to escape. There's going to be several rebellions. One of the more famous ones of the escapees is Henry Brown. This guy had his slave friends box him up and ship him to the north. And he makes it. He gets up there, and people up there, he becomes a free black man in the north. But he had to make that entire train trip on his head, because when the cargo people at the train station loaded him onto the train, they didn't know there was a person inside, and they put him on his head. And so he rode the entire way on his head. It's really kind of sad. Now, I've listed in your notes some of the most well-known rebellions, starting with the Stono Rebellion in 1739. Later on, you have Prosser's and the New Orleans Rebellion, Denmark Vesey, and the last big one's going to be Nat Turner's Rebellion. You'll notice in the dates that these are somewhat far apart. That's because the slaves were still outnumbered across the South. Even though there was a lot of them in South Carolina, for the most part, they were outnumbered. And every time one of these rebellions happens, you're going to have the slave masters exert more control over the slaves they do have, because they don't want the same thing happening to them. And so you're going to find that the rebellions are a little bit spread apart. Now, there's one I want to tell you about, a slave I want to tell you about, that is outside of one you might have heard of. Her name is Harriet Jacobs, and she was a very pretty slave girl up in the Virginia area. And her slave master was always after her for favors, if you know what I mean. And she did not like this. In fact, she would go so far as to have a relationship with another white plantation owner and have children by him, so her old geezer guy would leave her alone. Well, her grandmother had gained manumission earlier on for something wonderful she had done for the community. She had gained her freedom, but still lived in the area. And so Harriet Jacobs is going to manage to escape from the plantation. Her grandmother is going to hide her in her attic for 7 years. For 7 years, this girl does not come out of the attic. Her children are living with her grandmother. She can see them through the cracks in the floorboards, but they don't even know she's up there until she finally can escape and make it up to the Massachusetts area. Later, the father of her children are going to get her children out of there and up to her in Massachusetts as well. Later on, she's going to write, after the Civil War, she's going to write several things about lynchings in the South. She's a very, very interesting woman. But one of the reasons that she got stuck for 7 years in the attic was because of Nat Turner's rebellion. As soon as that happened, all the slave masters clamped down and were all very watchful about any slave that wasn't where they were supposed to be, so she had to wait even longer. Now, we also know about the Underground Railroad. Now, this is not a train that goes under the ground. It is a series of safe houses that are strung all across the northern states, all the way up to Canada, because they had to get all the way to Canada to be totally safe. Like I said, there are bounty hunters all over the northern states looking for escaped slaves. And so they would go from one safe house to another. Sometimes these were caves. Sometimes they were root cellars. If you know the book Little Women, Louisa May Alcott wrote this book. Her family hid slaves up in Massachusetts. So your Underground Railroad was a system of slaves trying to escape. Of course, Harriet Tubman is known as the conductor of the Underground Railroad, and she is probably the most well-known and associated with this escape route. One more thing I want to make sure that you know before I get out of just talking about slavery is that between 1800 and 1860, there were about 1 million slaves that were shifted from the upper South to the lower South. So just because they outlawed the slave trade in 1807, where they couldn't bring in any more slaves from Africa, that did not mean that they could not trade them amongst themselves, and they will do that a lot. That's one of the reasons Frederick Douglass is going to manage to escape. His master will trade him to another man who is exceptionally cruel, and Frederick Douglass is going to, I think he punches him and then runs off and manages to escape. He's one of the ones whose mistress, when he was little, taught him how to read and write until she got into trouble for doing that. And then he's going to use food to bribe his little white friends to teach him, to continue to teach him how to read and write. And so he's probably one of the most well-known of the escaped slaves. Now, the next section I want to talk about is reforms that come out of this time period. So we're going to start off with the Second Great Awakening. Now, the First Great Awakening happens in the decades before the Revolutionary War, and the Second Great Awakening is going to happen in the decades before the Civil War. And most of this happens in the 1820s and 30s, somewhat into the 1840s. And it's another religious revival. The leader of this one is a man named Charles Finney. And he's going to use a different tactic than Whitefield and Edwards used in the First Great Awakening. He's going to appeal more to people's emotions. It's going to be more about self-improvement, about things like the human nature and how to improve oneself. And so it's going to cause people to start looking at what they believe and what they're doing, and seeing how sometimes these things don't fit together. Um, and it's going to cause a lot of people to turn that guilt factor into a cause for conflict. So a lot of your churches are going to fracture. This is when you're going to have a multitude of different forms of Baptists. I think there's something like 350 forms of Baptist. You have the Southern Baptist, the Northern Baptist, Free Will Baptist, Fundamental Baptist, Missionary Baptist, and that's just a few of them. This is when the Church of Christ is going to splinter, and after this point, you're going to have the Church of Christ, and you're going to have the Disciples of Christ. And so a lot of this splintering is going to be over the issue of slavery, and how do you justify owning all these people and justify being a Christian at the same time? And so that's going to cause a lot of churches to split and a lot of people to throw accusations at each other. Another area that's going to look at reform is going to be the area of women. Women have been pigeonholed into these separate spheres. It was the women's place to stay at home, be the little mother, have all the children, do all the cooking and the cleaning and whatnot, and it was the man's job to go off and earn the living for the family and bring home the bacon, as it were. And this is going to be an idea that exists all the way up until the 21st century. My dad, who was 89 when he passed away. He lived until 2013. And he would not mop the floor or do the dishes or any of those, because that was women's work. Now he would haul out the trash, he would do mow the yard, all that kind of stuff, but it was that idea of that was a woman's job and this was the man's job. Well, you get into the late 1840s and women are sick of this. They can't own their own property. They're not allowed to go to school. All these different things that make them less in the eyes of society than the men. And so they're going to rise up, and they're going to have a convention. It's called the Seneca Falls Convention. It's going to happen in upstate New York, and they're going to start talking about the things that they want to see happen. Now, this is a reform that starts in this time period, and yes, some things get changed, but it doesn't really come to fruition until we get into the 20th century. But women are really going to speak out, and this is where they're going to get their first public voice, is speaking out against alcohol. They are tired of their husbands going out and getting totally wasted and coming home and beating the tarnation out of them, or leaving them with the children and just disappearing and never coming back. And so they are trying to get the consumption of alcohol outlawed so that they can hopefully find a more stable life because of it. So the two women that you really need to keep in mind that were part of this Seneca Falls Convention in this picture right here are going to be these two ladies right here. This is Lucretia Mott, and this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Women are going to be leaders throughout this whole movement, and so you got to kind of fit your women into their time period as we talk about them. So right now it's these two. After the Civil War, you're going to learn more about Susan B. Anthony. We get closer, or further into the 20th century, you'll learn about Alice Paul and that group. But for this time period, the key names are Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now I put this photo over here. Wearing bloomers became popular during this time period. Women were actually in something like pants. And that's because of a woman named Amelia Bloomer. So that's yet another one of the reforms. So we have religious reform, we've had women's reform. These two people here are going to be fundamental in other social reforms. Horace Mann is going to promote education reform. Back during this time, the only people that got to go to formal school were really rich little boys. And then young men as they got older. But he was promoting free public education and compulsory education, so you had to go. And at this time, it's going to go, I think up to the 6th grade. And over time, they're going to just continue to add years. When I was a small child, kindergarten was not part of the public school system. If you got to go to kindergarten, it's because your parents were rich enough to send you to a private school to have kindergarten. But later on, by the time we get into the 1980s, it's now part of the regular school day. And so this idea of having an educated populace, it is, as much as everybody hates going to school, education is freedom, education is power. And so by being able to read and write, know if someone's taking advantage of you. I mean, that's the way dictators and totalitarian governments maintain control over large numbers of people with relatively a small force, is by keeping them ignorant and hungry. And so by all of us being educated, that better secures our freedoms and our rights. So that's Horace Mann for education. This lady right here is Dorothea Dix, and her focus was on asylums for the mentally ill and orphans, and then also for prisons. You'll find on Blackboard, associated with your notes, a film clip to a small section of a movie called The Miracle Worker. And this segment is where Annie Sullivan is telling Helen Keller's parents what the asylum was like and how horrible it was. So you might want to take a few minutes and watch that. I'll give you a better idea of how horrible these mental institutions were, and places where they put orphans as well. Prisons back in the day were even worse than they are now. Now you have to keep in mind that prisons are supposed to be a bad place. The guards are not there at the prison to protect the prisoners. They're there to keep you in or keep prisoners in. But they were really, really horrible back during this time. And so that's what her focus is going to be. And then the temperance movement was the widespread movement to outlaw alcohol. Now, I'm not going to say a whole lot about this now. This is just the very beginnings of it. When you get into 1302 and you start talking about the 1920s, that's when the outlawing of alcohol is really going to have its biggest impact. But this is where it all starts in this time period. Of course, one of the biggest movements of the time is going to be the abolitionist movement. And this is trying to get slavery abolished in the United States. And there are going to be several leaders throughout this time period. This here is William Lloyd Garrison. He was the editor of a newspaper called The Liberator, and he was an in-your-face abolitionist. He was not going to be shut up, and he was not going to be quiet until they abolished slavery. So he was a really fiery character. You have a group called the American Colonization Society, and they come up with what they think is this great plan. Let's just gather up all the slaves and send them back to Africa. We're going to form a whole new country for them called Liberia. It's the only country outside of the, that's a foreign country that is named after a U.S. president for their capital, and that's Monrovia, after James Monroe. But the slaves at this time, we're talking about 1840s, they've been in this country now for a century or more, and they know no one back in Africa anymore. So that kind of idea didn't really take off very well. Sojourner Truth, and this is her right over here. I tried to find a younger picture of her because this is her, rather up in years, much after this time period, but I couldn't find one. So, but this is Sojourner Truth. She was an escaped slave, and she is going to be a big proponent of abolition. And of course, this guy right here, Frederick Douglass. He makes it up into Massachusetts. I believe he was fundamental in getting the Massachusetts 54th Regiment put together. That was the first black regiment that fought in the Civil War. So all of these are big movers and shakers within the abolitionist movement. But there are some other aspects of this movement that you have to understand. Up in the North, abolitionists were not well liked. The North was complicit in the slave trade. Just because they didn't own slaves themselves didn't mean that they didn't participate in it in another fashion. They really weren't too excited about getting rid of slavery because they knew that that would be replaced with wage labor picking the cotton. It was going to make the cost of their raw cotton to go up for their textile mills up in the north. And so Northerners were not interested at that time in abolishing slavery as long as it stayed down there in the South. They were not too big on it as far as having to compete with wage labor if the freed slaves moved up to the north, and that is going to be an issue after the war. Both sides are going to use the Bible as a defense that slavery is a good thing, slavery is a bad thing, and we can prove it by using the Bible. And they could. You can justify anything using the Bible if you take a small portion of it and take it out of context. And so it's going to start to create this turmoil and this bubbling pot that's going to continue for the next 15 years. After we gain all of the area west of the Mississippi, then you're going to have a group called the Free Soilers emerge, and their idea was to keep everything west of the Mississippi free. No blacks we're going to be allowed over there, and it wasn't because they were anti-slavery, but they were trying to promote poor whites, and they not only did they want that land open for whites, they also wanted the government to give it away instead of selling it. And so that's the group that are the Free Soilers. They want to keep all the new territory free from slavery. And so that's that particular movement. Also during this time period, you're going to have utopian societies form. The first one is the Owenites. Most of these societies are located in the northern states. And they're scattered across. I mean, I think the Owenites are over close to like the Ohio area, where Brook Farm is over in Massachusetts. The big thing you need to remember is that all utopian societies fail. The idea that everybody can share and share alike, and we're going to all work equally and we're going to profit equally is really good on paper. It always works on paper. It never works in reality because it doesn't add in that human aspect of greed and avarice and power hunger and all of those things that go into the human nature. Anytime this works out, somebody always thinks that they're entitled to more than somebody else is. And so they usually fall apart. Now with these societies, the one I'm showing you here in the frame, these are the Shakers. The Shakers were a religious utopia, and they were called that because they shook when they worshipped. But they believed in absolute celibacy, which meant they had no physical relations between men and women, so therefore they did not create any little baby Shakers. And they could not attract new members to their group any other way. And so they will eventually just basically die out. The other group that of note is the Oneida community. The Oneida is best known for the silverware that they made. But they believed in sharing everything, absolutely everything. And women, girls, we know how we are. We don't share nicely, especially our men. And that always causes trouble. And so they will eventually fall apart. The only lasting thing from the Oneida group is what they made. Walk down the silverware aisle of Target or Walmart or Penny's, any place that sells silverware, and you're going to find some of the boxes that have Oneida written on them because it's still a silverware company. And then the other group that I want to talk about is Brook Farm, and they're located up in Massachusetts. And this is the group that Louisa May Alcott's family was part of. The Emersons, Thoreau. Hawthorne wasn't exactly a part of the group. He kind of stood on the periphery of the group. But they were all friends together up in Massachusetts. And so that's the utopian societies. You also have got transcendentalism. This was a new thought process, belief system, where they believed that truth came from within, and that you could find it through self-reliance, self-actualization, self-culture. So I'm trying to give you all these different words that have always been associated with transcendentalism. These two guys right over here are the two guys most associated with it. So that's Henry David Thoreau, and this is Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so that was a really big thought thing going on during this time period. In your English classes, you might be reading about transcendentalism. I know some English classes focus on this at some point during the semester. Now, also, you have got writers that are going to appear because technology has improved to increase readership of things more than just the news. So you're going to have novels that are going to come out, and short stories, and poetry, and it's going to be very popular to go to an evening of poetry reading. Now, we think that would be absolutely boring today, but back in the day, that was very, very popular. So some of your famous writers, this guy right here, this is Edgar Allan Poe. He's known for writing a lot of macabre short stories like The Raven and The Telltale Heart. But he also wrote poetry. One of my favorite poems of his is El Dorado, and it's about the city of gold called El Dorado. Other writers of the day are going to be Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was a well-known poet. When I was a kid, I had to memorize the poem Song of Hiawatha, where you might have read the poem The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Both of those are his works. We also have got history books that are being written. We've been far enough away from the beginning of the country that now we can start objectively analyzing the history of the country. You have to get probably about 50 years away from an event for you can stand back and objectively evaluate the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever happened to an event. So by the time we get into the 1840s, we've been around, at least in North America, since 1607, so we can start evaluating the history of the country. Other writers of the time that are more novelists are going to be James Fenimore Cooper and, I forgot some off the top of my head, Washington Irving. Washington Irving writes The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and James Fenimore Cooper writes The Last of the Mohicans. Those are probably the two most well-known of these authors. But they were award-winning. Now, these novels do not come out in book form like they do today. Even Charles Dickens over in England, it doesn't come out in book form. It comes out a chapter a month in magazines. I don't know if I could have survived having to read Harry Potter one chapter at a time. I mean, I read the first 4 books in 2 weeks. And so, but this is how they all came out at that time. Art during this time is landscape art. It was called the Hudson River School. And that's how easy it is to keep Hudson River School and landscape art together because a river is part of a landscape. So you're talking about fields and streams and trees and mountains, stuff like that. And so that's some of the culture stuff going on during this time. Technology is going to pick up and go on. Medicine is going to come out with a lot of new advances. Before this time period, if you had to have any kind of surgery, whether it was an amputation or what have you, they pumped you up with a lot of alcohol and gave you a stick to bite on, and then tied your arms and legs down while they did the surgery so you couldn't help. It was gruesome. So starting in this time period, and it gets better and better, but even during the Civil War was not just available everywhere, but they're going to come out with morphine, and they're going to come out with ether. Ether is an anesthetic. They don't use it as often anymore because it's a gas, and you have to be really careful with it, because back in this time period, you could knock out the patient and knock out the doctor at the same time because it was a gas that would fly in the air. But you have medical advances. You also have got mass production. Now, it's in its infancy. It's not the assembly line yet, but this idea that the more you make, the cheaper it is to make it is going to start during this time period. Elias Howe is going to come out with a sewing machine. Sewing machines were treadle, and so girls, we had great calves back during this time because we worked everything with our feet. So it was the treadle sewing machine. You had the same type of treadle action on a spinning wheel. You even rocked your baby's cradle with your foot back and forth. And so the sewing machine is going to make sewing move so much faster. Samuel Morse is going to come out with the telegraph, and that's what this is right here. That's the transmission side of the telegraph. So your Morse code of that's Morse code. By the time we get to 1860, there's going to be 50,000 miles of line strung across the country for the telegraph. they're going to come out with free incorporation laws, which is going to make it easier to form corporations. It's going to make it more secure for people want to invest in these companies as capital, so that they only lose what they invested and they're not made responsible for whatever debts that the company incurred. And so that's going to be a big thing. And then John Deere is going to come out with the steel plow. It's going to be a wonderful thing. I don't know if you guys have ever tried to help your parents out in the yard in the summer, and you're digging a hole for a bush or for whatever you need to, and you've got that shovel pointed straight down into the ground, and you're standing on it, jumping up and down, trying to get that thing to go into the dirt, and it ain't budging. Well, that's because we've got very hard ground around here. With a steel plow being pulled at this time by an animal, it's going to cut the ground easier and be easier to be able to furrow, to make to plant your crops and stuff like that. So that's going to be a really big advancement for this time period. And then last but not least, you have the advent of new transportation advances. We've already talked about turnpikes, roads, and canals, and the steamship, but they're also going to come out with clipper ships. Clipper ships are small, more maneuverable cargo ships that can go faster and can go through more shallow water and tighter water streams. So, for instance, to get from the eastern side of the United States to the western side of the United States, you had to go all the way down around South America. Well, that gap of water between the tip of South America and Antarctica is called Drake's Passage, and it is some of the most treacherous water in the world. The wind blows, the seas and the waves are enormous. If you've ever seen the movie The Perfect Storm or the movie Moby Dick, those were all set in that area of the ocean. And so it could be very dangerous. Well, these little clipper ships could go through the Straits of Magellan, those little island water passages that are at the bottom of South America, instead of going through Drake's Passage. So if you can make the trip faster and safer, then you can cut your overhead and therefore offer your product at a cheaper price and still make a profit. If it's at a cheaper price, more people can buy it. And so you're going to make even more profit that way. So that's why the clipper ships were really good. The Iron Horse is another name for the train. And the first trains were pulled on tracks by horses. By the time we get into the 1840s, you've got steam engines that are fueled by mostly by wood at this time and then later by coal, that are going to crisscross the country. Here is a map of the railroad network by the time we get to 1850s. And most of it, you can tell, is up here in the northern states. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as we get into the Civil War. But you have all this train track up here. Now, it's interesting at this time that you have different railroads that control different track. So, say this right here is controlled by the Pennsylvania Railroad. This one's the B&O. This one's the Reading, and each one of them have a different width for their rails. So some may be narrow gauge, some medium, some wide. And so every time you had to go from this track to this track, you would have to offload your cargo and reload it onto a different train, which is going to increase the cost of shipping. Okay. But they're going to crisscross, especially the northern part of the country, with the train, and it's going to create the first nationwide market economy. So it's Lincoln America. And then you also have got the Pony Express. Now, the Pony Express, and let me see if I can move this over this, well, not me, move this over this way. I'm going to move me out of the way. There, how about that? And this is a symbol for the Pony Express. We have got this fascination with the Pony Express. For some reason, we think it's so romantic for these guys to have gone riding horseback across the country, delivering mail, but they were only around a year and a half. They're going to be replaced fairly quickly with the telegraph and the stagecoach, which is going to make it faster and safer to be able to deliver information across the country. Now, the last part of the notes for today is a diagram that's in your notes about the way the rail network worked. And so I've got in there for you how we could take raw materials from this part of the country and we can ship them this way, train them over this way to the mills and the factories over here, and they can be exported out to other countries this way, or they can be sent down this way. Down here, they can take their raw materials, especially cotton, and they can train them up here. And so this is kind of giving you a picture in your head of what the transportation revolution is going to do for the economy of the United States. So this is where I'm going to stop today. Next time we'll pick up with going west and how we acquire other stuff west of the Mississippi. And so until we get to that point, I will see you then. Have a great day. Bye.